All right, we are about a minute in, so I am going to go ahead and I'm going to get started. So my name is Mollie Cox. Welcome to the presentation. So this is the Neuroscience of Intuitive Design. So today we're going to kind of take a look at design, and we're also going to take a look at the geeky side of science and what that means, design and science together. So one thing I want to preface by saying, I know there's this awesome little chat tool on the side. As you guys are chatting, if you have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. I, however, will not answer them until the end. If I watch the chat, I'll get lost in the chat and not be present in the own presentation. So just so you know, I will be looking at those questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Mollie. I am a product designer. I've been in the industry for about coming on to 20 years. Right now, I'm currently product design director at a company called Grin, and we are based in Sacramento. So what we do, we are in the creator economy, and we create software for brands to help manage their partnerships with creators and influencers. So we help from everything with their campaigns to contracts and things along those lines. I've also worked on the agency side, and I have been on the global tech company side. So I've been everything from startups to enterprises and everything in between. And somewhere along the way, I got interested in science, and I got interested in not only how our brains work, but how our brains work very specifically with design. So when we say words like intuition and intuitive design, what does that actually mean to us inside? What is our brains doing in that moment? So that's what we're going to talk about and discover. Now, one thing to also say before we get started, I know many of you in this room are obviously here because you're designers, and we're designers at heart. So when we talk about the design side of things today, we're going to go back to the basics just a little bit. We're going to go relay that foundation of some things we already know. So that way we can easily apply it to the neuroscience that we're going to talk about. So just bear with me for a little bit in the beginning as we go through this. But again, for anyone who joined who didn't hear, I'm Mollie Cox, and it is a pleasure to have you here. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right. But before we do, I want to do a quick quiz with everybody here. Now, this is remote. Typically, I'm used to being in a room with a lot of individuals, but just play along with me here. So what I want you to do is I'm going to ask a couple of questions, 3 to be exact. And when I ask these questions, I just want you to think the answers to yourself in your head. Okay. Don't need to shout them out. Don't need to put them in the chat or anything along those lines. Just think silently to yourself. So let's go ahead and get started on this. Okay. Question number 1. I want you to name 5 bass players. All right, go. I'm going to give you a couple seconds. Getting them? Okay. Okay. Now, question number 2. I want you in your head to name 5 goalies in the NHL. All right, go ahead. I'll give you a couple seconds. Getting them? Okay. All right, last one. Okay. I want you to name 5 TV producers, and their names cannot be Shonda Rhimes. Okay, go. Got them? All right. We should all be sitting with 15 names in our heads. Okay. Now, did you guys get all of them? I'm going to guess you probably didn't. Probably not. Now, you may not have gotten answers because you don't necessarily follow the NHL, but one thing I almost guarantee is that you listen to music and you watch TV, but you probably didn't get all 10 of those names. And you know why? Because you don't notice them. They're so good at what they do, you don't notice them. And that's what intuitive design is, right? If it's really good, you may not even notice it. It's just like a great bass player in a band. If they're doing their job and they're doing their job well, you may never notice them. The same is true for your software. The same is true for design. If a user is using your software and doing so intuitively, they're just using it easily and not even noticing it, right? So really good design just feels right. Okay. Buttons slide under your fingers. You progress to the next action very, very quickly. You see patterns that you recognize and you move through quickly. Things feel easy and you progress to the next action very, very quickly. And you know what? Internally, it just feels good, right? Good design just feels good. But what gives you that feeling? What's actually happening in your brain in that the wetware when something just works, when it feels intuitive and it just feels right and it just feels good? Well, as a product designer, and I know most of you in the room are the same way, what I love to do is I love to open up the hood and see how things work and really understand it. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to open up the hood to our brains. Obviously, the proverbial hood, not the real hood here. We're just going to talk about what we see and we're going to take a peek into there and we're going to see what's happening in our brain when software is just intuitive. So we need to talk about the design side and the neuroscience side. So as I said earlier, we're going to talk about a little bit of the fundamentals of design so we can start to apply that to the neuroscience. So let's start with design, okay? So what is intuitive design? So what you're seeing right here, this is what we call a functional spec doc. Now, developers used to get these back in the day, and it basically told us it's almost like a requirement doc. Right now, you might know this as a PRD or an initiative doc or something along these lines, but they were all the specs to what we needed to build our software as, right? But there was usually always one line in these functional spec docs, and they all said that design should be intuitive. But it wasn't defined, right? What does that even mean? Do you think if you went and asked the CTO what that meant, that they would be able to answer? Of course not, right? What about the CEO? The CEO should know, right? So if we went and asked the CEO, what does it mean when this should be intuitive? Would they know? Probably not either, because we know it when we see it and we feel it, okay? We know the feelings, and the thing we know is intuitive design feels natural to us. Now, your brain has a decent idea on how things work, and you can reason about things. It's very much like in this picture you're seeing, it's very much like Tetris pieces, okay? You can make predictions about the future, and the future conforms to those predictions. So if you look at this piece, I can see these two Tetris pieces right here. And I can say to myself, okay, Mollie, if I take these two pieces and I put them together, I'll probably make a rectangle. So my brain made a prediction about what was going to happen. And that future actually conformed to that prediction because I was able to notice a pattern, right? Now, this just isn't about software either. Take doors, for example. Normally you don't notice doors. You use them every day. You go through them. But when you see one that doesn't work well, it's super annoying, right? So take this photo, for instance. I see a door here and I have handles on both sides that are identical and there's no signage. It's the same. So what do? Do I push or do I pull it? I have no idea. And now I'm getting super frustrated. But then how many of you have run across a door where it's like this and it's the same thing? Do I push or do I pull? I've used a door. I see a handle. I know what I should do. But now my brain's having to work really hard and figure out and take a moment for something that should take very little time and figure out the right path forward. So my brain's going back and forth. And ultimately, what it could be saying to myself is I just need to push it. Like, I don't know. I'll just push it, right? Well, what this is in everyday usability is usability. So it's software and it's the items that are all around us. And usability is important because we need that to understand and how we measure usability. So let's take a look at the usability scale. Okay. So we see on here multiple different areas on this scale, all the way from what WTF all the way up to intuitive. Designers try to move up the scale towards intuitive. We research, we design, we prototype, and we test, and we redesign, and we test again, and then we test again, and then one more time for good measure with actual people, right? So our North Star is intuitive. It all comes down to usability, okay? But what about the other things on the scale? What about conventional? What is this on the usability scale? Well, conventional usability is when a user recognizes patterns that they've seen elsewhere, maybe mental models that they're aware of, and they have to adapt those mental models to your application. And it takes some time, but not necessarily much. So a good example of this is perhaps calendars. Okay, so maybe you're creating a piece of software and you have a calendar and you've made it your own. You've put some of your own bells and whistles in there, and you've launched it out to the world, and a user comes to use it and it's not necessarily what they're used to, but they have practical application from an Apple calendar, or they've used Google calendars or Outlook, and they can take those mental models and apply it and figure out how to use it pretty quickly. So it may not be intuitive, but it's still conventional. And then we have learnable. This is where users start to get some struggles, okay? They're starting to make some guesses about how to do things, but patterns are repeated, and patterns are repeated to follow mental models that they've seen in the past. So users start to gain confidence quickly because we're using those same patterns. And then there's memorizable. This one's a toughie, and I've seen a lot of enterprise software use memorizable usability models, okay? So this is essentially where you're asking the user to follow steps, literally 1, 2, 3. Think about, I need to enter into an input field, so I'm going to tab 4 times over, I'm gonna type into it, then I'm gonna hit return, and I'm gonna tab 2 more times, the arrow button down 2 times, and then hit return, and I'm done. That's not easy. And I oftentimes have to write that down. And then if I forget or I lose my Post-it note, I might forget the steps and lose my way. And this is the type of software where if you change something, users get very frustrated because what you've done is you've changed what they've memorized, right? So you could take something that you think is more usable, move the input field down 2 spaces. Well, now you've messed up their whole pattern. So memorizable on the usability scale is not obviously awesome. And then you have WTF. This is just, if you're below memorizable, you probably need to just start over. Okay, so that is the usability scale. Now, there's only one true rule when it comes to design. And I know most everybody in this room has probably read this book. And if you haven't, you should go read it. But it's Don't Make Me Think, written by Steve Krug. This is one of the best design books ever written, and it's pretty much timeless. And he says there's only one rule when it comes to design, and that's to not make me think. But he says it takes a lifetime to master. And ultimately, humans hate thinking. We don't even read. We literally don't even read. This is an example in the book that I love, because ultimately when we create a site or software application and we think about the content, we think people are going to take time to read through everything. They're going to read this, they're going to pause for some reflection, and then finally click on a very well-chosen link. You and I both know that's not how users use a website. Basically, we look at it, we panic, we skim it, we guess, we try, we look feverishly through the website for anything remotely clickable to what we're trying to get through. We muddle through, and then we click it. And if it's wrong, then we have to go back, and we'll finally read something if we absolutely have to. And you and I do this too, every day. We call it alert blindness. These little guys. What do you do with these when you see these come up? Kill it immediately, as fast as you can, because we don't have time for it. It just interrupted our flow. It just interrupted our intuition. It felt bad. And suddenly we were frustrated and confused and didn't want to read it and just get it out of the way. So we do that too. But the more a user has to think, the less usable the software is. And intuition isn't thinking much, right? So that's pretty standard knowledge right there. Now, it also takes more energy. The more actual neurons are firing in your brain, the more you make somebody think. And we're going to get to that in just a couple minutes, okay? But ultimately, nobody wants to think because it's really hard. It's really hard work. And there's another reason, a secret reason, something that not a lot of people are going to tell you, okay? And that is nobody gives a shit about your software. Okay, now I'm not saying that it's worthless. On the contrary, people pay a lot of money for your software. But the thing is, they don't care about your software. They don't want to think about your software. People care about what they can do with your software in real life, right? So it could be as mundane as just crushing candies on their phone, right? They don't want to think about that, but it could build up the scale. It could be cross-checking prescriptions or even something as massive as landing a 747. People use your software for big things. Now imagine if you're trying to land a 747 and your software is memorizable. You have the lives of people in your hands, right? They need to be able to use as little thinking as possible. So the scale starts to look like this. Poor design, or rather the failure to design, pushes you down that scale. It makes people think, and it prevents them from getting stuff done with your software, which ends up costing your company money, right? So the more energy used, and the more thinking, the less stuff is getting done and the less money your software is making. Okay, so those are the basic principles of design. Like I said, we were going to take it back to the foundations. And at this point, you could say, Mollie, I don't even give a shit about your presentation because I know all this stuff. And I say fair enough to that. But this is where I hope your love of all things nerdy is going to make you start to appreciate kind of the science behind design. So we're going to jump into the neuro side of this. Let's get started on that brain part that I was talking about, okay? So we need to talk about the brain structure and what is actually happening up here, okay? So this is kind of what we used to think of the brain as. This is what we call the triune brain, okay? There were three primary parts to it. There's this big upper part that we called the new brain, which was really the analytical thinking to things. That's where all the thinking happened, was in this new brain. Then we had the mammalian brain, which is emotional. That's where our emotions are. And then we had the reptilian brain, which you know better as fight or flight, what you hear quite often. But now we know better. We've had a lot of time to do a lot of research, okay? And we've started to learn some things by observing. So one of the things that we now know is that some fish actually use tools, right? They have found a way to use tools. So actually finding Nemo might not have been that far-fetched. Take the octopus, for example. Even they have none of the new brain that I just told you about, yet they can solve puzzles very easily. In fact, sometimes I get stuck on TikTok watching octopus solve puzzles. It's fascinating, but they have none of that new brain. So when you look at the brain structure of vertebrates, we see bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and then mammals. What we know now is frogs have mammal brains. Fish even have mammal brains, and an octopus can solve problems because they have a mammalian brain. Okay, but we're people. So what's happening in our brain, right? What's happening now? So let's take a walk through kind of the parts and functionality of what's happening in our wetware, all right? So first and foremost, we have what we call the basal ganglia. And this is where procedural memory happens. This is movement and repeated movements. So I like to use this example. Think about when you drive home from work, or when you used to. I mean, we're sitting here remote. A lot of us don't commute anymore, but there was a day when we did. So think about that commute home that you used to have, right? You would get in your car, exhausted and tired. You'd turn on music, you'd drive home, and then the next thing you know, you're in your driveway. You're like, how did this even, I don't even know how I got here, right? That is our procedural memory. That is the basal ganglia in action. And it's also like hitting a baseball, right? That repeated movement, muscle memory, swinging a bat, also riding a bike or swinging a golf club, things along those lines. That's what happens in your basal ganglia. So then we have the amygdala. So this is now known as the limbic system. We went from the new brain into the limbic system, which is still pretty controversial, but I'm going to call it this because there's nothing better yet to call it. But amygdala is where our emotions are. This is where we have those death matches in our heads, right? Like, are any of you gamers? Imagine you're playing a video game, you're playing Fortnite, I don't know, something along those lines. And you're playing against somebody, you get really frustrated. All of a sudden, you're super emotional and throw that controller across the room. May not go that far. That's just an example. But that is your amygdala at play, right? That is what is controlling those emotions. And then you have your brainstem, which connects everything. Now I could show you a picture of an actual brainstem, but I thought that this might be kind of a better representation. Your local IT server network room. Now, if there's any IT people here, I'm not saying your server room looks like this, but this is literally what your brainstem looks like. It's just a crap ton of wires and connections in your skull, just like a network server room, okay? And this connects everything together. And then we have the cerebellum, which is our voluntary movement. So not procedural, but our voluntary. It's kind of those little hanging bits at the bottom of the neocortex right there. But this is where what tells us to take a step forward and how we know we're taking another one when we walk. This is that voluntary movement that we have. And then the neocortex. So if you think of the brain, this is typically what you're going to think of. And this is where thinking happens. This is where we think. But what about that really hard thinking that I was talking about earlier? That is our prefrontal cortex. This is where problem solving happens. This is where our active thinking is. When we're thinking about thinking, it all happens here. So when we're super far down on that usability scale, we're demanding our users use their prefrontal cortex for that work, okay? So how do we think then? Well, let's focus on that prefrontal cortex and why thinking is so darn hard, okay? So the human brain has roughly 100 billion neurons, and each of those are connected to about 1,000 other neurons, making about 100 trillion connections in our brains. 100 trillion connections, and those are patterns, concepts, and memories, okay? But I've said this word a lot, a neuron. So what is a neuron, really? Well, ultimately, it's a cell, okay? It's just a little cell in your brain, and it takes energy in, and it passes it out. So let's look at this. So this is a neuron. There are three primary parts to the neuron. We have the nucleus, which is called the soma, and this is where information lives, okay? And then above that, you see these little tree things on the end. Well, these are called dendrites, and these are where signals come in, and they're coming in from other neurons. And how they're doing that is it travels down the axon into the axon terminals, and that's where signals go out to make connections to other neurons. Okay, so we have the axon terminals, the dendrites, and the soma. So ultimately, when we're making connections, it looks like this. They connect together, the terminals connect to the dendrites, and suddenly make recognitions of patterns and signals that's passing through each neuron. So let's look at a signal, okay? So we have this one little signal that's built up in the neuron, in the nucleus, okay? It travels down the body of the neuron into the axon terminals. It connects to the dendrites of another neuron, and then that one little signal travels down into the next neuron. So that's one little piece of information, that one little signal. But then what happens, how we start making connections, is these signals build up, okay? So the signals build up and they travel down and build up in the body. And maybe, like in this example, there's 4 pieces of information that's coming through. And so the soma creates these 4 signals. It travels down the axon into the dendrites, into the other neuron, and then there's what we call a threshold. And when they reach the threshold, they fire forward. It fires out, it releases, and we start to make connections. Okay, so this is how we think. This is how connections are made. Information travels from one neuron to the next. It sends signals into the next one of another neuron that has more information that matches what you've already known. Okay, so then we start to make multiple connections, and neurons that fire together often make multiple connections. And the stronger the signal, the more we understand. So the more we recognize something and the more we've used this signal, the faster it fires. Okay, that increases their strength. So fewer inputs lead to the same output. So in this example, you see this information, 5 pieces go, it fires quickly into the next one and attaches to the neuron, and it happens so rapidly. This is what we call the easy path in neurology, when neurons fire rapidly to form an idea. Now, what's crazy is in design, we also call this the happy path, right? Think about when you do usability testing. We're trying to get users through the happy path of our application or our piece of software. The same is working in our brain. When we say the happy path, we're meaning that easy path of neuron firing to make things very quick and rapid. But what is the actual output of a neuron? Okay. Well, ultimately, neurons are pattern matchers. Think of each little signal that you saw in those examples, those 1 little dots. Each little signal is a clue. And we take all of those clues and we put those together and we create a pattern. So let's do this exercise together. Neurons are essentially responsible for recognizing patterns, say parts of a letter. So if you look at this right here, what we can see is there's numerous different types of lines, right? This one says we have a southeast to north central connection. Then we have a horizontal crossbar. And we have a left vertical line and a concave arching line, a bottom horizontal line, and a top one. All we're seeing is lines. So think of each one of these lines as a little signal. Our brain says, hey, look at this line, look at this line. But then we start to put those together. Those signals build up and they build into letters and shapes and eventually words. Your neurons start firing. Dendrites are connecting to more axon terminals that are firing, and suddenly you're creating a concept. My brain says, here's a line, here's a diagonal line, here's a straight line. Oh, that's an A. Oh my gosh, what's another letter? Ooh, a curve, a P, a P. Oh, apple. My neurons just fired all of those signals off to one another. I made those connections so easily because they're patterns I recognize, right? So it kind of starts to look like this. Eventually, a concept forms into an idea. So your brain just said, hey guys, I just saw the letter, I saw a triangle and a crossbar. That's an A. Hey, I just saw the letter A. P, ooh, P, A. Oh, apple, apple a day. Apple a day keeps the doctor away. My brain just had a massive rapid firing that took milliseconds of time for me to see one little line, connect it to another line, and then suddenly form the sentence, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Okay, that is how ideas are formed, and that's how we create concepts through neurons. So an idea is just a particular group of neurons that are firing together. All the little signals form, and we create what is known as one idea. So I'm going to show you this. Some people may know what this is. If you know what it is, don't type it in the chat, but I want you guys to look at it for a second. I want you to think about what this is. Put it together. Okay? So I'm going to show you what your brain may be thinking right now. So you can see it. I can see it. You can see that maybe there are letters. Maybe that's an O. I don't know. Could be. But now your prefrontal cortex is kicking in and is like, hey, let me help. This looks like a puzzle that I can solve. So you can read it and make sense that it's probably letters, but you can't read it. So your frontal lobes immediately kick in. And then, yeah, I got nothing. Because sometimes you just don't have the connections. You haven't made those connections, right? So there's no pattern for you to recognize. Those neurons are firing off signals to other neurons that have nothing there to help you make a connection to that pattern. So suddenly it looks like this. Hey guys, I just saw a shape that I think is an A, right? Your puzzle solving brain probably figured out it's a language, and then it's letters, and then it's probably a word, but that's about it. And after that, it was a dead end. So how did that feel in your head when I showed you that word? You probably tried for a second. And then just like the questions I asked you earlier, you may have given up because you just don't know. And it's not worth your time, right? So it may have felt a little bit difficult. What if I show you this? Anybody want to take a crack at this? I mean, that's a lot harder than one word. Your brain probably looked at that and said, nope, not even going to try it, right? I want you to think about this. This, what you're looking at, is how poorly designed software feels. It's like translating Russian all day long. Your brain simply cannot make the connections to the patterns that you're presenting a user because those patterns have not existed. You're making them think and work really, really hard. And by the way, this is Anna Karenina. If any of you want the full transcript after this, just message me. I'll send you the Amazon link. The other word that you saw actually was apple. Okay. But your brain could not make that connection unless you knew Russian, of course, which I'm sure some of you do. And if you did and didn't say it, thank you so much for that. But what does this all mean, right? Earlier, I said we have a natural ability to create predictions and allow the future to perform or conform to those predictions, because ultimately our brains are prediction machines. Okay. We know how to walk and we know how to talk, having a conversation, especially. We're predicting, we don't actually know what we're going to say next, but our brain is putting that together. Our neurons are firing and forming the next thing that's going to happen. We're creating connections and patterns in our language. We know how to talk. We know how to write, to sing. All of those require prediction. It's like, I like this example. Think about when you're driving at night and your headlights are on and all you can see is about 5 feet in front of you. Okay. Your brain knows that at the end of those lights where you see the road end, that there's going to be more road beyond the light. Our brains can predict that there is something beyond that light and we trust it and we move forward. That's called our prediction machine. And if we couldn't predict, we'd walk around like Robbie the robot all day, where he is programmed to lift one leg, move it, put it down, and then lift the next one, move it, and put it down. But you see, we as humans, we assume our foot's going to strike the ground and we're already moving on to the next step. And you know what else is cool about predicting right? Is we get dopamine. That's right. Our brain gives us a hit of dopamine, the pleasure drug. And we are as addicted to dopamine as Charlie Sheen is to winning. I'm sorry, I had to throw that in there. I'm old and that's a super old reference, but it makes me happy. So thanks for maybe chuckling along with me. But it's true. We are very addicted to dopamine, right? But what happens if we're wrong? What happens if we're walking through this and we don't know what to do anymore? We're reading Russian. Well, the thing is, you have to do more work. If you're wrong, you have to start over. Neurons literally cannot make connections. You have those signals and they're firing, but they're getting nowhere because they're not connecting to anything that you know of. Nothing fires off and we have to think about it all over again. And then ultimately, you don't get the dopamine and it feels bad. So remember when we said that design just feels good? That's the dopamine. You went down an easy path, the happy path, an intuitive path, and it was right. And it felt good because you got a hit of dopamine. So let's do a quick review of this. So here's how neurons work. Neurons transmit signals and they connect to each other. And then ones that fire often connect strongly to other neurons. Right? And strong connections make it faster and easier to have a certain idea. And an idea is just a particular group of neurons firing together. And we like to take ideas and turn those into predictions. And if we're right, we get drugs. And if we're wrong, we do not get drugs and we have to start over. So let's tie these things together. How do they converge? Now you're thinking, cool, Mollie, my neurons have been firing in overtime trying to figure out all this neurology that you're telling me about. And I've been working really hard. So I'm going to help us put these two things together. Okay. So let's go back to this usability scale. Again, intuitive. That user moves through your software with no or very few issues. So what is that in terms of the brain? That's the easy pathway, right? We're taking the easy road. One signal sent, and you were right. There was no backtracking. There was no retrying. We weren't reading Russian and meeting up connections that didn't exist. The easy path is an apple a day. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, and bam, I just got dopamine. Okay. But what about this one? What about when it's here? Well, this is all thinking, and it's really hard thinking because it doesn't make any sense. It's Russian all day long to your users. Okay. So again, a signal will travel down if we're on this side of the usability scale and build up in that body of the neuron. And it's that one little signal, but it may never go anywhere because it can't connect to anything. It's not connecting to any patterns that we understand. So we are at a standstill. Our brains are at a standstill. And then we have to start all over. And we have to think about a new connection. And our neurons can't fire to anywhere. Right? It's like a choose your own adventure book. And you're holding all the last 5 decisions with your fingers, flipping back and forth between all of them. It is exhausting. And it's exhausting in our brains. We're using so much energy doing that. So remember earlier, I said thinking more takes literal more energy if your software isn't designed well. It literally does in your brain. Okay, but what about the rest of the stuff on that scale? Don't go thinking you can just aim for above WTF and be just fine. Memorizing isn't great either. And here's why. So remember this guy, the basal ganglia, that procedural memory and those repeated actions like hitting a baseball? Well, we could get that involved as well. Take a look at this web page, this amazing web page right here. That is a true web page. Well, trying to figure out how to use this web page is like a toddler learning how to use a baseball bat. They have to do it over and over and over again until their basal ganglia memorizes it, right? So it's not easy. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy to do this. Now, when you're playing baseball, when you're little, what's that little word that they use to you all the time? Practice. Practice, practice, practice. To get muscle memory, you have to practice. Think about this. If you're on the memorizable side of the scale, you're asking them to practice, practice, practice using your software. Have you ever been excited to practice using Word? Or how about Visio? I haven't. I don't know about you, but that doesn't get me excited, right? Learning the tool that is supposed to make your job easier, not trying to memorize it, okay? You should never ask a user to memorize it. That's hard work. And now they're also engaging at the basal ganglia, okay? If you ask me to memorize something, this is probably what I'll look like when you tell me to do that, okay? So ultimately, I'd be so much happier if you just don't make me think. Steve Krug had it right all along. So is it really worth it though? Like really, really worth it? Worth all the trouble and the cost to get our software on that side of the scale? Yes, because remember that one secret that I told you about earlier? They don't care about your software. Users don't care about your software. They care about what they can do with it. So making that investment for people to be able to use your software easily with very little thinking and very little energy spent will help you help them get more stuff done and help you sell more software, right? So it is worth it, right? That's how you get more money, ultimately, when you sell your software. So this is how kind of the economics all converges with this. The more people you have getting more done, the more money your software is making. And that's because we're gliding up that scale towards intuitive. We're creating an easy pathway in our neurons. We're creating very little energy for our users to use. And it's making them happy because they're getting dopamine. They're making the right decisions and they're using the happy path. So on that note, thank you for giving a shit today about your software. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this presentation. I have some acknowledgements and attributes to give to other people. Obviously, I'm not going to read through these, but please feel free on your own leisure to take a look later, should you so choose. Also want to give a huge shout out to a friend of mine, Adam, who works at a company called Switchboard. He's a senior developer. Help me workshop this, put this together. So on that note, again, I am Mollie Cox. I appreciate you taking a little bit of time with me today. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. I have a website that you can go to as well. So feel free to reach out. Any questions you have, always happy to answer those. With that, I'm going to give that back over to Matthew and let him take it away for maybe potentially any questions that we have today.
Nicely done, Mollie. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that a lot. And wow, what a presentation style you have. That was very entertaining and extremely informative. Thank you. And Sina said in the chat window, wish you'd taught the biology class at school. I would have got more than
I don't know that I would have been great at that.
I don't know. What else? Got a couple of other comments. A lot of applause there at the end. Great presentation. Feel like I understand neuroscience just a little better. And yeah, I love the way you fitted. You drew it together with the design at the end there. It made so much sense. Thank you. Kimberly says design should be intuitive is not a testable requirement, therefore an invalid requirement. Coming from the software side here. Yeah, how do you test the intuitiveness of software, I guess is the question there.
Yeah, so how do you test it is a really great question. And one of the things that as designers, that's where we do that usability testing. And I kind of touched on it a little bit during the presentation.
Yeah.
In regards to a lot of times what we try to do is create what we call that happy path and see the deviation from users in what we call that happy path. So that is where the users are going down the easiest fundamental use. Now, again, I agree with what Kimberly is saying. It's really hard to test that theory because what you may call the happy path actually may not be super intuitive, maybe intuitive for the software that you're using. But ultimately, it's really hard to actually make that a requirement because it's all biased as well. But we know patterns that exist. We know behavioral and mental models that exist. So the more that we can apply those to the software that we're using and test that towards a happy path, the more usable that software is going to be. So.
Okay. And the question just come in, which is good, which is how do patterns become patterns in the first place?
Yeah, great question. Ultimately, let's dive into the logistics of neurology, shall we? But ultimately, what I said in there is those little patterns are actual those signals. And what I'm trying to say in that, the more those signals build up, we store those signals, right? And when we store those and we see them often, then they fire rapidly and make quicker connections. So ultimately what happens is our brain is storing those signals, and those signals, when they fire, is what starts to form patterns, right? But to get into the semantics of an actual pattern, we have about an hour and a half left here, Matt?
I wish we did. Sure, we could use it.
Cool. Well, I know we're probably at time for a lot of users. So any questions that I see on here, I'll type some messages back. But again, I really appreciate all of you. Thank you for coming to my presentation. Thank you for coming to Convey UX in a whole. Pleasure having you here. Reach out to me if there's anything you guys have questions on.
Thank you so much, Mollie. That was greatly appreciated by a lot of people. Nice to meet you, and enjoy the rest of your day, your sunshine out there.
All right, you too. Bye, everyone. Appreciate
Thanks
you much.
Bye.